November 12th, 1944. The fog hung thick over the English Channel that morning, clinging to the grey waters like a shroud. On the deck of a Royal Navy vessel, a group of 37 German nurses stood in silence, their Red Cross armbands removed, their identities reduced to prisoner numbers written on cards that hung from their necks. The youngest among them was barely 19. The oldest had served in field hospitals since the invasion of Poland. They wore the exhaustion of war on their faces. Hollowed cheeks, eyes that had seen too much, hands that trembled slightly in the cold. One of them, a woman named Helene Fischer from Hamburg, clutched a small leather diary against her chest. In it, she had written the names of 73 soldiers she had watched die in a field hospital outside Caen. She believed she would never write in it again. She believed she was being transported to her death. The engines thrummed beneath their feet. The white cliffs of Dover emerged from the mist like the walls of a fortress. None of them spoke. They had been taught that the British were cruel, that they starved their prisoners, that the democracies of the West were decadent and weak, but also somehow barbaric in their treatment of the defeated. They had been told these things in training, in rallies, in the careful language of their officers. Now they were about to discover if any of it was true. The war had turned by the autumn of 1944, though not everyone could see it yet. The Allied invasion of Normandy in June had cracked open the Western Front. German forces were retreating across France, leaving behind not just soldiers, but the entire apparatus of occupation: administrators, translators, medical personnel. Among the captured were hundreds of nurses and doctors, men and women who had staffed field hospitals and aid stations from the beaches of Normandy to the forests of the Ardennes. The British had a problem. Their own medical services were stretched impossibly thin. Hospitals in London, Manchester, Liverpool and Birmingham overflowed with wounded servicemen, with civilians injured in bombing raids, with burns victims and amputees, and men whose minds had shattered under the weight of combat. The National Health Service did not yet exist. Medical care was a patchwork of municipal hospitals, charity institutions, and overworked staff who had been at war for 5 years. And so a decision was made, quiet and pragmatic. German medical prisoners would be put to work in British hospitals, not as free citizens, but as supervised labourers. They would tend to Allied wounded. They would see the interior machinery of a nation they had been taught to despise. And in seeing it, something unexpected would happen. The first group arrived at a military hospital in Kent on a grey November afternoon. Helene Fischer was among them. She had expected bars on the windows, armed guards at every door, rations of stale bread and water. What she found instead was a building that smelled of disinfectant and boiled cabbage, staffed by weary British nurses who looked at the German prisoners with suspicion but not hatred. The matron, a broad-shouldered woman in her 50s named Miss Cartwright, addressed them in clipped formal English that was translated by a German-speaking British officer. She told them they would work 8-hour shifts. They would receive the same meals as the British staff. They would sleep in dormitory rooms with proper beds. They would be watched, yes, but they would not be mistreated. If they worked well, they would be treated fairly. Helene did not believe her. She had been taught that the enemy lied as a matter of policy, that kindness was a trick, a prelude to cruelty. But that evening, when the German nurses were led to a dining hall and given plates of stew with actual meat in it, bread with margarine, and cups of tea with sugar, she felt the first crack in the wall of certainty she had built around herself. The work began the next morning. Helene was assigned to a ward filled with British soldiers recovering from wounds sustained in the fighting in the Netherlands. Men with bandaged stumps where legs had been. Men with burns across half their faces. Men who woke screaming in the night. She moved among them with the efficiency of her training, changing dressings, administering medications, emptying bedpans. The British nurses watched her carefully. The soldiers watched her too. Some refused to let her touch them. One man, a corporal from Yorkshire, spat at her feet and called her a Nazi bitch. She said nothing. She had expected worse. But others were different. An older sergeant with a shattered pelvis asked her, In halting German he had learned as a prisoner himself in the First World War, where she was from. She told him Hamburg. He nodded slowly. He said his unit had bombed Hamburg in 1943, that he had seen the fires from his aircraft, that he had not thought about the people below until much later. He said he was sorry. She did not know what to say to that. She had lost her younger brother in those fires. She had been taught that the bombings were acts of terror, proof of British savagery. But this man, lying broken in a hospital bed, did not look savage. He looked old and sad and tired of war. The days became weeks. Helene and the other German nurses settled into a rhythm. They worked their shifts. They ate in the dining hall. They slept in their dormitory under the supervision of British guards who, after the first tense days, began to relax slightly. Some of the guards shared cigarettes with them. One, a Scottish private named MacLeod, taught a few of the younger nurses how to play cards. The hospital itself became familiar. Helene learned the names of the British nurses she worked alongside. There was Sister Patricia, who had 3 brothers serving overseas and who cried quietly in the supply closet when she thought no one could hear. There was Dr. Abernathy, an elderly physician, who moved through the wards with the slow, deliberate care of a man who had seen too much death to be hurried by it. There was the orderly, a Jamaican man named Winston, who hummed hymns while he mopped the floors and who once told Helene that he missed the sun more than he missed anything else about home. These people were not monsters. They were not the caricatures of enemy propaganda. They were simply people, ground down by the same war, trying to keep each other alive. But it was not the people that shocked Helene most. It was the abundance. Even in a nation at war, even in a hospital operating under rationing and shortages, there was more than she had seen in Germany for years. The bandages were clean and plentiful. The medications were available. The food, though plain, was regular and sufficient. The doctors did not have to choose which soldiers to save based on dwindling supplies. There was waste even. Bread thrown away because it had gone stale, sheets discarded because they were torn. In the field hospitals she had worked in France, they had reused bandages until they disintegrated. They had performed surgeries without anesthesia because there was none left. They had buried men who might have lived if there had been just a little more of everything. Here, there was enough. Not plenty, not luxury, but enough. And that sufficiency spoke to something deeper, something that gnawed at the edges of everything she had been taught. She had been told that the democracies were weak, that their systems were inefficient, that their people were soft and divided. But this hospital, this exhausted, overcrowded, understaffed hospital, functioned. It functioned because the people in it believed it should, because they worked to make it so, because there was some organizing principle beneath the surface that did not require the threat of violence to keep it running. One evening in late December, Helene was sitting in the small room the German nurses used for their breaks when she overheard a conversation between 2 British nurses. They were talking about Christmas, about how they would spend it. One was going home to see her parents in Sussex. The other was staying to work because, she said, someone had to, and the boys in the ward deserved a decent Christmas dinner. Helene realized with a start that these women had a choice. They could leave. They could refuse to work. There was no Gestapo waiting to arrest them for desertion, no party official monitoring their loyalty. They stayed because they chose to stay, because they believed in what they were doing. It was such a simple thing, and yet it overturned something fundamental. In Germany, in the world Helene had known, duty was enforced through fear, through ideology, through the constant pressure of surveillance and punishment. Here, duty seemed to emerge from something else, from a sense of shared responsibility, from the quiet knowledge that the work mattered. She did not have the words for it then, but she felt it, a shift in her understanding like the movement of tectonic plates beneath the surface of the earth. By January 1945, the German nurses had become part of the hospital's routine. They were still prisoners, still watched, still marked by their origins, but the sharp edge of suspicion had dulled. Some of the British staff began to speak to them as colleagues rather than enemies. Dr. Abernathy, the elderly physician, asked Helene one afternoon about her training. She told him about the rigorous program she had completed in Hamburg, the emphasis on discipline and obedience, the belief that a nurse's highest duty was to the state. He listened without interrupting. Then he said something she never forgot. He said that a nurse's highest duty was to the patient, that medicine was not political, that the body did not care what flag flew above the hospital. It was a simple statement, almost banal, but it struck her with the force of revelation. She had been taught that everything was political, that every action served the greater purpose of the nation, that individual care mattered only insofar as it strengthened the collective. But here was a man who had spent his entire life in medicine, who had survived one world war and was now enduring another, telling her that the patient came first. Not the state, not the ideology, the patient, the individual, the single human life. The transformation was not sudden. It was not a dramatic moment of conversion, no Damascus Road epiphany. It was slow, cumulative, the result of 1,000 small observations. The way British nurses treated their patients with a kind of rough compassion, neither sentimental nor cold. The way the hospital, for all its flaws, operated on the assumption that every life was worth saving, regardless of rank or background. The way even the German prisoners were fed, housed, and treated according to rules that seemed, however imperfectly applied, to matter. Helene began to write in her diary again. She wrote about the soldiers she cared for, but also about what she saw around her. She wrote about Sister Patricia, who shared her tea rations with the German nurses, even though she had no obligation to do so. She wrote about Winston, the orderly, who told her stories about Jamaica, and who treated her with a courtesy that made her ashamed of the things she had believed about people who looked different from her. She wrote about the hospital cat, a scrawny tabby named Churchill, who seemed to belong to no one and everyone, who curled up on the beds of dying men as if offering a final comfort. These details, small and seemingly insignificant, accumulated into a new picture of the world. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing. News filtered into the hospital, the fall of Berlin, the suicide of Hitler, the unconditional surrender. The German nurses heard these reports in silence. Some wept, some sat in stunned disbelief. Helene felt something she had not expected. Relief. Not joy, not triumph, but a profound, exhausted relief that it was over, that the dying would stop, that perhaps there was a future after all. The British staff did not gloat. There were no celebrations in the hospital, no triumphalism. The work continued. The wounded kept arriving. The dead kept dying. The war ended not with a bang, but with a slow, aching diminishment, a gradual easing of pressure that left everyone too tired to do anything but keep going. Helene remained at the hospital through the summer. The German nurses were not repatriated immediately. There was nowhere to send them, no functioning government to receive them, no clear answer to the question of what came next. So they stayed, and they worked, and they became something other than what they had been. In July, Helene was transferred to a civilian hospital in London to help with the backlog of cases that had accumulated during the war. She took a train from Kent, watching the English countryside roll past the window, green and quiet and scarred by years of preparation for invasion. London was battered. Entire neighbourhoods had been reduced to rubble. Buildings stood half-collapsed, their interiors exposed like wounds. And yet the city lived. People walked to work. Shops opened. Children played in the bombed-out lots. There was a resilience here that Helene recognised but could not fully articulate, a refusal to be broken that seemed woven into the fabric of daily life. The civilian hospital was larger and more chaotic than the military one. Helene worked in the maternity ward, helping deliver babies to women whose husbands were still overseas, to women who had survived the Blitz and the V-2 rockets and who now faced the task of rebuilding their lives. She held their hands during labour. She cleaned the newborns and wrapped them in blankets. She watched as mothers looked at their children with expressions of fierce, protective love. And she thought about her own mother, who had died in the Hamburg firestorm, who had never had the chance to see the end of the war. One afternoon, a young British nurse named Emma asked Helene what it had been like in Germany. Helene did not know how to answer. She could have spoken about the rallies, the flags, the sense of purpose and belonging that had once felt so intoxicating. She could have spoken about the fear, the way people stopped trusting their neighbors, the way families were torn apart by ideology. She could have spoken about the field hospitals, the endless stream of wounded, the slow realization that they were losing, that all the sacrifice had been for nothing. Instead, she said simply that it had been a lie. Emma did not press her. She nodded as if she understood, though Helene doubted she could really. How could anyone who had not lived it understand what it meant to discover that the foundation of your world was false, that the certainties you had built your life upon were smoke and ash? But Emma's quiet, acceptance, her willingness to listen without judgment, was its own kind of answer. It suggested that perhaps the truth mattered more than the tribe, that understanding was possible even across the deepest divides. By the autumn of 1945, the first war crimes trials were beginning in Nuremberg. The full scope of the atrocities was becoming public. The concentration camps, the systematic murder of millions, the industrialization of death. Helene read the newspaper reports in the hospital's break room, her hands shaking. She had not known. That was what she told herself. She had not known. She had been a nurse, a healer, focused on her work. But the knowledge sat heavy in her chest like a stone. How could she not have known? How could any of them not have known? The signs had been there, the disappearances, the whispers, the careful silence that settled over certain topics. She had chosen not to see, had chosen to believe the lies because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. Now there was no choice. The truth was undeniable, and it demanded a reckoning. Some of the other German nurses refused to believe the reports. They said it was propaganda, that the Allies were exaggerating to justify their victory. But Helene could not sustain that denial. She had seen too much by now, had spent too many months in a world where people told the truth more often than not, where the newspapers printed retractions when they got things wrong, where the machinery of society operated with a degree of transparency that would have been unthinkable in the regime she had served. In October, she was called to a hearing to determine her status. She was not accused of any crimes. She had been a nurse, nothing more. But the British authorities needed to decide whether she could be released, whether she posed a threat, whether she could be trusted to live as a civilian in occupied Germany, or whether she should remain in Britain. She sat in a small office and answered questions. Where had she worked? What had she believed? Did she still believe it? She tried to be honest. She said she had believed in the beginning, that she had been swept up in the fervour, that she had thought they were building something great. She said she had stopped believing gradually, that the evidence had accumulated until she could no longer ignore it. She said she was ashamed, not just of what had been done, but of her own blindness. The British officer interviewing her was a middle-aged man with tired eyes. He listened without expression. When she finished, he asked her a single question. What would she do now? She said she did not know. She said she wanted to help, somehow, to make amends, though she did not know if that was possible. He nodded. He told her she would be released, that she could stay in Britain if she wished, or return to Germany. The choice was hers. Helene chose to stay. There was nothing left for her in Hamburg. Her family was dead. Her city was rubble. Here, at least, she had work, a place to sleep, a fragile new beginning. She continued at the hospital through the winter. She took English lessons in the evenings, practiced until her accent softened, until she could move through the city without drawing stares. She made friends, cautiously, tentatively, with people who knew where she was from and did not hold it against her. She learned to live with the guilt, the knowledge that she had been part of something monstrous, however peripheral her role. The guilt did not fade, but she learned to carry it, to let it shape her actions without paralyzing her. She became a good nurse, then an excellent one. She specialized in pediatrics, working with children who had been injured in the war, who bore scars both visible and hidden. She was patient with them, gentle, understanding in a way that came from her own experience of being broken and slowly mending. Years later, in the 1960s, Helene would write a memoir. It would be published quietly, without much fanfare, a small book that told the story of her transformation. She would describe the moment she first arrived in England, the fear and confusion, the slow unraveling of her beliefs. She would write about the British nurses who had treated her with fairness, the patients who had seen past her nationality, the system that, for all its flaws, had operated on principles she had not understood until she lived within them. She would write about the abundance that had shocked her, not wealth, not luxury, but the simple sufficiency that came from a society organized around human need rather than ideological purity. She would write about freedom, not as a grand abstraction, but as the accumulation of small choices, small dignities, the ability to speak without fear, to question without punishment, to change one's mind without betraying one's soul. The book would not become a bestseller. It would not change the world. But it would be read by a few thousand people, and some of them would write to her, thanking her for her honesty, for showing them that transformation was possible, that even those who had served evil could find their way back to humanity. The story of Helene Fischer and the other German nurses is a small footnote in the vast history of the Second World War. It does not appear in most textbooks. It is not commemorated with monuments or memorial days. But it matters, because it speaks to something fundamental about the nature of ideology and freedom. Totalitarian systems, whether fascist or communist or any other flavor of authoritarianism, operate on the assumption that people must be forced into virtue, that without the machinery of propaganda and punishment, society will collapse into chaos. They teach their citizens to fear the alternatives, to believe that other ways of life are weak, decadent, barbaric. And for a time, people believe it. They believe it because they have nothing to compare it to, because the walls around them are high, because the cost of disbelief is too steep. But when those walls come down, when people are exposed to the messy, imperfect reality of free societies, something shifts. They see that abundance does not require oppression, that order does not require terror, that people can choose to do good without being forced. They see that the lies they were told were not just false, but inverted, that the real weakness was in the system that required lies to sustain itself. This is the shock that Helene and the other nurses experienced. It was not the shock of witnessing cruelty. They had expected that, had steeled themselves for it. It was the shock of witnessing normalcy, of seeing people muddling through, making mistakes, bickering and complaining, but ultimately cooperating, building, caring for one another without the need for an iron fist to hold them together. It was the shock of realizing that freedom, for all its inefficiencies and frustrations, produced something that coercion never could. A society where people chose to stay, to contribute, to care, not because they had to, but because they believed it mattered. This is the lesson that authoritarian regimes fear most. The reason they build walls, not just to keep enemies out, but to keep their own people in. Because once you have seen the alternative, once you have tasted even the imperfect fruits of freedom, it is almost impossible to go back to believing the lies. Helene Fischer died in 1989. Just months before the Berlin Wall fell. She lived long enough to see the beginning of the end of the Cold War, the cracks forming in another totalitarian edifice. She did not live to see the reunification of Germany, the return of her homeland to the community of free nations. But perhaps she did not need to. She had already made that journey herself, decades earlier, in the wards of British hospitals, where she had learned that the enemy was not the other side, but the lie itself. The lie that people needed to be enslaved to be saved, that freedom was chaos, that abundance was a sin, that questioning was treason. She had learned that the opposite was true, that it was the lies that enslaved, the lies that impoverished, the lies that killed. And in learning that, she had found her way home, not to a place, but to a truth. That human beings, given the chance, will choose life over death, cooperation over coercion, the difficult work of freedom over the easy comfort of obedience. This is what shocked her. This is what changed her. This is what, in the end, might be the only real victory that matters. Not the triumph of one nation over another, but the triumph of truth over lies, of openness over secrecy, of the stubborn, unglamorous, everyday work of people choosing to be decent to one another, even when no one is forcing them to be.